Endless Dungeon recently released a vertical slice of the game in the form of what is called OpenDev, and I was lucky enough to get a seat to try it. So today we're going to take a quick look at the 2 available levels as well as the game design so far, so you can see if you should wishlist it or hold off until we get some more information. Now before we dive in, here is the intro video to give you a little bit of context as to what direction they're going with this OpenDev.
Ah, there you are. I've been waiting for you. Welcome to Endless Dungeon's first run OpenDev, buddy. Natasha here. I'll be in charge of reading your complaints. Lucky you, you've been selected to embark on this journey of co-creation and co-design with the community. You're in for it now, pal. This OpenDev scenario has been designed by the dev team to get your feedback on specific game features. Of course, Endless Dungeon is a much bigger game than what you're going to see here today. So please note that this playthrough does not represent the final game content or quality, because we're still working on it. You now have a few days to try and find your way out of the dungeon, but it'll be tough. Will you have what it takes to face the station? Once you're done, we'll ask you to answer a series of questions that our game designers have put together so that you can help make Endless Dungeon the best-in-class roguelite. We're looking forward to hearing from you, and hope you enjoy playing the game. See you on the other side.
Hey everyone, welcome to the first ever
OpenDev
for our upcoming roguelike tactical tower defense game. It's Endless Dungeon. So where does the story take place? Found themselves on a space station that's an artifact built by ancient beings known as the Endless. There's a mysterious force that drags in any ships that get too close, which is why the station is inhabited. Some are here to seek riches, others to conduct experiments, and many are, to put it simply, stranded. As they attempt to make their way to the core of the station to fix things so they can escape, they discover that each time they get killed by monsters, they get reloaded back at the station's hub. And that is what's about to happen to you. But before we send you out there to die, we thought we'd give you a few tips on how to play. Explore each procedurally generated level and try to make your way to the exit. You will need to protect your crystal, which sits on a cute, crawly little robot, but if it dies, you die, so be careful. Energy shards from the crystal power the room. The crystal also does neat stuff like open doors. You'll want to start by building turrets on turret slots and positioning your heroes. Each of your heroes has their own special abilities that you can use with archetypes you might recognize, like the gunslinger or tank. There are lots of different types of mobs, and you'll discover that different types of weapons are more effective against certain monsters. They attack in waves, so be careful. You'll also be earning resources that you can use to upgrade your heroes and turrets, as well as new weapons to equip during your run.
Starting out, yes, it is basically Dungeon of the Endless, and it will feel super familiar to those that played it. For those unfamiliar with it though, the goal of both that game and this one is to escort your crystal as far along as possible in a dungeon without letting it get destroyed. The major difference between the original and this one is that it has real-time action RPG style combat rather than the more turn and room-oriented combat of its predecessor, and they are promising roguelite aspects as well, though in this early build the meta progression was mostly unavailable outside of unlocking a third player slot by completing the first 2 dungeons available, so we'll have to wait and see what it ends up feeling like. Though jumping into the game itself, namely the combat, it feels a lot better with controller than mouse and keyboard, so that's what I ended up favoring, and it definitely gave twin-stick shooter vibes and was more than competent at what it was doing, and I would wager as we see more characters added, it will feel a bit more diverse. Though for this slice, all 3 of the possible characters were ranged DPS units, so they did feel a little similar outside of like fire rate and special ability. With the potential addition of melee characters and possibly support characters like the original, it will feel a lot more rounded. Now, upgrading these characters, which in my opinion is a rather key aspect of games like this, did not feel nearly as good. We no longer have the inventory screen of the previous game, and you no longer level up with food, but rather go to stations and buy perks, though you are limited to 1 perk per character, of which they felt rather samey for the most part. And as far as your weapons, you can hold 2, and they do at least feel a little unique in some cases, with different firing patterns and damage types. As far as the resource management, which is key for this type of game, I wish they would return to the food upgrade system with level-based perks, as well as the food healing system with the previous game, rather than utilizing the station upgrade and medpack systems here, since it made the food feel a lot more important before, as opposed to now, where it feels like, for the most part, that gaining food is fairly useless outside of having resources to buy those healing packs, since even merchant spends on it don't really add much, if any, value. In addition to food, we do have a few other resources though, with research serving as a tool to gain technology for turrets and room defenses, and it does this through a system of having you slot research into a terminal and then defend both the research terminal and your crystal from the spawning enemies for a duration of time, which can be a challenge, but with a little prep, it's fairly straightforward to defend 2 points instead of just 1, especially early on. And of course, since you're researching those new techs, you do need a resource to build them, and that is the form of industry. These points are basically the cornerstone of this game, the way it is built right now at least, because you no longer have the other resources providing near as much utility. This is amplified since the weight of industry is heavily enhanced with the greater reliance on turrets due to the real-time nature of the game rather than the pseudo-turn-based like before. This is because, unlike enemies spawning in dark rooms in the last game, since you started a new turn by opening a door, in this game they are on a timer and will spawn as you explore from fixed spawn points, removing the impact of dark rooms, the strategy of lighting up rooms to prevent spawns, and planning around these that made the floor strategy so interesting before, so it felt like they kind of took something away from the whole kind of genre. Now, the last key resource is Dust, which was a big resource in Dungeons of the Endless, but is an almost afterthought here. It's still able to power rooms, but it is a permanent spend now, though on the flip side, a large number of rooms are already powered naturally, so you'll only have to use it for certain cases, and it's pretty rare. For example, if there's a research location in a room, or you need it for defensive purposes. The other side of Dust is that it can be used to upgrade your crystal, which you are given 3 choices for from a random pool, with that pool containing buffs for your allies in the room, debuffs for the enemies in the room, and probably the only thing you'll actually want to spend it on, extra resource generation from your crystal. Now, why that extra resource gen is pretty much the only one worth gathering the scattered dust for is that it's permanent, unlike powering rooms, since you cannot reclaim it from your rooms you spent to get your power on your way out, so yeah, a little less useful there. Now, generally speaking, those resources will be what you're juggling the most, though they are mostly juggled for the tactical side of the game, which is basically what you focus on between the waves of enemies. Simply put, all these resources are going to, in one way or another, go towards making sure you defend that crystal, and that is mostly done with turrets now that the heroes cannot be buffed near as much, and you can almost always throw more turrets between point A and B to damage and slow the enemies, but you're not going to have as many resources to buff your hero. Now, a small problem I have with these that I did not have in Dungeon the Endless is that they feel a lot more impotent. Sure, they respawn after the wave ends, so you're not wasting a ton of resources replacing them, but for the most part you need a lot of them at a choke point to not have them collapsing each time and losing their upgrade opportunity. And since it's procedurally generated, you can get a series of crappy, indefensible rooms with either too few nodes, or nodes in some of the worst locations you can imagine, since the range is based on rings rather than rooms now. For me, with the exception of some of the advanced towers, I found the ranges to be just frankly kind of bad. Sure, they're enough to beat these early 2 stages, but if we scale it up into the more difficult levels, these turrets will quickly become somewhat frustrating to try to place rather than strategic. I would personally recommend they either buff the ranges to a more reasonable level so you can actually have overlapping towers with just base level towers, or just make the towers a bit more potent in of themselves so they can kind of stand alone. As it stands, even exploiting weaknesses, a number of the enemies are already spongy enough that they'll just walk by and ignore them, and they'll just go after your key infrastructure since they can get by them only taking a couple hits. And it's a similar situation with your player weapons as well, since you, like I said before, you cannot force levels on your character, so you can't really ramp up that damage to obscene levels. So overall, I would say my opinion of the OpenDev is that it's going in the right direction for the most part. It feels good to play. The actual gameplay is good, it just needs some tweaking and balancing on the tactical side. And it is a bit too early to talk too heavily on performance as far as like the actual game running, but it did run fine on my system while I'm technically under spec by a few generations, and had it on high while streaming and recording, and it came out just fine. Now, there is one thing that I usually don't bring up, but since since this is still in development as far as it goes as a title, I feel that it's important to mention that I do not like that there's a plan to include de novo in this. This has been a fight in the past, and while I don't blacklist games for it, I certainly am more likely to favor similar games without it integrated into them, due to a number of issues I have with this form of just DRM, which in time will undoubtedly burn legitimate owners of the titles. The reason being, this is not much different from situations like Securom and SafeDisk in the past, except in the case of de novo, it will go down if Erdetto ever stops supporting it or goes out of business, rather than if the new platforms just cease supporting it, which, funnily enough, can happen too. And this is all before the performance hits, but your mileage varies there depending on how much work the devs go to minimizing it. Now, if you have any questions about the game, feel free to ask them down below, and I will try my best to answer. And as always, a special thanks to the channel members, patrons, and Twitch subs that continue making content like this possible.